Welcome to the deep dive. Sometimes it feels like you're doing great with English in class, but then you watch a movie or like a YouTube video, and suddenly it's like everyone's speaking this whole other language. It's
Yeah.
so frustrating.
Yeah, it's a pretty common experience for language learners. Classroom English, it's great for the basics, but out there in the real world, native speakers, they throw in slang and contractions and they talk so fast, it can be tough to keep up.
Totally. So today we're going to dive into how to bridge that gap. And get this, we're going to get some help from some pretty unexpected sources, celebrities.
I think you might be surprised by what we find.
All right, so to kick things off, we're starting with a pop star. Someone who is known for like catchy tunes and really connecting with their fans. And in one of their speeches, she used a word that perfectly captures that awkward feeling we all get when we're trying to use a new language. She said, cringe.
Yeah, and it's interesting, she didn't just use the word, she actually encouraged her audience to embrace being cringe, which is like, whoa, think about that for a second. How often in language learning are we told to avoid mistakes at all costs?
It's true. It's like we're conditioned to be terrified of messing up.
Yeah.
But she's saying it's going to happen. It's okay. And what's really cool is she used cringe in the same sentence as a pretty advanced word, like retrospectively. It just goes to show that even native speakers, they're constantly mixing and matching their language depending on the situation.
That is such a good point, and it's an important insight for language learners. Don't get caught up in trying to sound perfect all the time. Sometimes the most natural way to speak is to embrace those cringe moments and just go for it.
All right, next up, we have a businessman known for his, let's just say, direct style of communication. And in this clip, he's actually talking about his political opponent. But instead of like bashing her, he says, she doesn't quit, she doesn't give up. I respect that.
Now, what's interesting here is not just what he's saying, but how he's saying it. He's using contractions like doesn't, which is so common in fast, casual speech. It's like a shortcut.
And he's also highlighting the importance of persistence, even when you're up against a tough challenge. He even uses those two words, quit and give up, almost like they mean the same thing, but they actually have slightly different shades of meaning.
Exactly. Quitting feels more like you're making a decision, and giving up has that sense of defeat. So when he says she doesn't do either, it really emphasizes her determination.
So what does all this mean for your language learning journey? Well, you might decide to quit using a certain app or method if it's not working for you. But the key is to never give up on your overall goal of fluency. You got to keep that drive, that determination to succeed.
And speaking of never giving up, let's move on to our next unexpected source of wisdom, a media mogul known for her inspiring speeches. And she has this really powerful message about how we think about failure.
She says there's no such thing as failure. It's just life trying to move us in another direction.
It's such a great way to look at it. And it's so true for language learning. It's easy to get discouraged by mistakes. But what if we saw them as feedback, like signs that we're pushing ourselves and learning?
It's like she's saying, hey, if something's not working, don't beat yourself up about it. Try a different approach. Explore a new path. Just keep moving forward.
I love that. It reminds me of that saying, the only way to fail is to quit. So how can we apply this to, language learning and specifically to understanding fast-talking native speakers?
That's a good question. I think it comes down to shifting your mindset. Like instead of fearing mistakes, embrace them. They're all part of the process.
I totally agree. It's about seeing those cringe moments as opportunities to learn and grow.
And maybe even laugh at yourself a little along the way.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Even native speakers, we all make mistakes. It's part of being human.
Okay, so we've got some pretty insightful advice from our first three unexpected experts, a pop star, a businessman, and a media mogul. Who knew they'd have so much to offer about understanding English? But we've got more to uncover.
It really goes to show you never know where you'll find wisdom about language, communication.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's a big part of what this whole deep dive is all about, right?
Yeah.
Finding those little pieces of insight that can help bridge that gap between like textbook English and the way native speakers actually talk.
Exactly. And sometimes those insights come from paying attention to how someone says something, not just the words themselves. Remember that clip with the businessman and what he said about his opponent? I mean, he could easily just attacked her, but instead he actually took a moment to point out her strengths.
And I mean, it definitely says something about him as a person, but it also brings up a good point for language learners.
Right.
Like sometimes the most important information isn't in the words themselves, it's in the tone of voice, the emphasis, even like body language.
Yeah, it's like you got to read between the lines. Pick up on those little cues, the things that give you a deeper understanding of what the speaker really means. And that's super important when you're trying to understand native speakers, especially when they're talking fast.
So what are some things that people can do to actually start picking up on those cues?
Well, one thing that's always helpful is active listening. It's not just about hearing the words, but really tuning in to how the speaker's delivering them. You know what I mean? Pay attention to their tone of voice, the rhythm, the way they emphasize certain words or phrases.
Yeah, it's like listening to music, right? You're not just hearing the notes, you're feeling the emotion behind it all.
Exactly. And when you start listening to spoken language with that kind of attention, you'd be surprised at how much more you can pick up.
I think one of the biggest challenges for language learners is moving away from that focus on individual words and towards a more holistic understanding of what's being said.
For sure. It's not just about decoding the words. It's about getting the nuances, the subtext, all those layers of meaning that aren't always explicitly stated. And that's where paying attention to things like tone and emphasis can really help you out.
And those contractions. Remember how the businessman said, I'll instead of I will? Those little things can be so tricky if you're not used to hearing them.
That's why it's so important to listen to a variety of different native speakers. Different accents, different styles of speaking. The more you listen, the better your ear will get at picking up those little variations.
It's like you're training your ears to be bilingual. And the best part is there's so much material out there to help you do just that. Podcasts, movies, TV shows, YouTube. The possibilities are endless, really.
And don't be afraid to use the tools available to you, right? Like rewind, slow down the playback speed, use subtitles if you need them. It's all about finding what works best for you and creating a learning environment that's challenging but also enjoyable.
I like that. It's a good reminder that language learning doesn't have to be a chore. It can be an adventure, like a journey of discovery.
And who knows, maybe you'll find yourself quoting a pop star, a businessman, or a media mogul in your next conversation.
Now that would be something. Speaking of unexpected sources of inspiration, for our next deep dive, we're going to look into the world of, wait for it, stand-up comedy.
Oh, wow. That's interesting. I'm curious to hear more about that.
Yeah. It turns out comedians have a lot to teach us about, like timing, delivery, and how to use humor to really connect with an audience.
And I bet they're not afraid of a little cringe either.
Not at all. Actually, a lot of times they embrace those awkward moments and turn them into something hilarious. So join us next time as we explore the surprising lessons on language and communication that we can learn from stand-up comedy.
I'm looking forward to it. It just goes to show language learning, it's everywhere. You just have to know where to look.
It's kind of wild how much we can pick up about communication just from really listening to how people talk, even if they're not who you'd expect, like these celebrities.
It really shows that communication goes way beyond just the words, right? It's the tone, how they say it, the whole context, all of it matters. And I think for language learners, that's a huge thing to remember.
Yeah, like you could learn every grammar rule in a zillion words, but if you don't get those subtle things that native speakers do, you're missing out on a big chunk of what they're saying, really.
Exactly. It's those nuances that make the difference between just understanding the words and actually getting what the speaker is trying to get across. Remember how our pop star talked about cringe? She could have used a fancier word for awkward, but cringe has that punch, that feeling, It hits different with her fans.
And I think anyone who's ever messed up in another language totally gets that cringe feeling. It's universal, right?
Yeah.
So by using that word, she's instantly connecting with people.
That's such a good point. It's like language isn't just about giving information. It's about making connections, sharing how you feel, fitting in, all of that. So if you're learning, don't be afraid to let your personality come through, even if you make mistakes sometimes.
Own those cringe moments. It just means you're putting yourself out there, trying new things, getting out of your comfort zone,
Exactly. That's where the real learning happens. So if you're feeling stuck with those fast-talking natives, think back to what we talked about today. Remember the pop star saying, embrace the cringe, the businessman, and his focus on not giving up, and what that media mogul said about failure not being the end.
Those are some seriously useful tools for anyone learning a language, and they can really help you understand how native speakers communicate on a deeper level. Just keep practicing that active listening, notice those little details, and don't sweat the mistakes.
Every mistake is just bringing you closer to fluency. And hey, who knows, maybe one day you'll be the one giving everyone else tips on understanding native speakers.
Until then, keep diving in, keep exploring, and enjoy the whole learning journey.